and begin my talk. And I wanted to just begin by kind of telling you what the general theme of this presentation is. Basically speaking, in Hungary and Poland, one sees or has seen in the last decade democratically elected right-wing governments that have sought to undo the constitutional order, one could say, the checks and balances in their political systems. You might well recognize the man on the left, the Hungarian leader Viktor Orban. His Fidesz party came to power in 2010. It was in fact the second time he'd come to power, and quickly created a semi-authoritarian system behind a kind of democratic facade. I'm sorry. Fidesz changed the constitution quite quickly, establishing party control over the judiciary, the civil service, the media, the financial sector, and the election system as well. On the right, Jarosław Kaczynski, his party Law and Justice won the election by a fairly narrow margin in 2015, but then proceeded to try to create a political system really on the model of the Hungarian system. And they've sought to undo media freedom, they've sought to tamper judicial independence, and so on. And the critical point here is that both of these countries are within the European Union, which is an entity devoted to democracy and the rule of law. And both of these countries have kind of teamed up to challenge the central institutions of the European Union, and indeed to press a populist agenda across Europe as a whole. So in a broad sense, as I already alluded to, this development in what we would call Central or Eastern Europe is part of a much bigger story. The rise of right-wing global or the right-wing populism. And by populism, this is a term that political scientists usually use to refer to movements that are illiberal, anti-establishment, but also appeal to popular support. I want to argue tonight that East European populism has its own distinct causes and its own forms. And to understand these countries and what's been happening there, and especially the degree of success in these two countries of establishing these populist regimes, one has to turn to their history, the history of the region, and also the ways in which history has been used, manipulated, maybe weaponized in this part of the world. So in particular, I want to talk about the history of nationalism and the understanding that I think is specific to this region of history as a struggle for national survival. So I want to start, as I do for my day job, by giving you a bit of a history lesson, very broad strokes, on these two countries, and then proceed to the present day. So generally speaking, Eastern Europe, Central Europe, these are in fact debated terms sometimes, passed in modern history from what you see on the left here to what you see on the right. On the left is Eastern Europe as an imperial space, a space dominated by large European empires, namely the Habsburg Empire, the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and also the German Empire. And in the course of its modern history has turned to what you see on the right, which is Eastern Europe, and really a Europe generally dominated by nations. And the key point here is that these big empires on the left had very complex multi-ethnic settlement. Today, that's not the case in Eastern Europe. You have states which rule on the doctrine of nationalism, which you could understand as roughly being the idea that state and ethnic borders should coincide. So in other words, states should fit nations without large numbers of minorities, and also that the state should represent the interests of the nation. And so the key for understanding this history is that Eastern Europe has had a very tragic 20th century, precisely in navigating this broad shift from empire to nation. Both countries we're talking about tonight did become nation states, as I mentioned, but they did so in extremely brutal, violent ways, largely by invasion from powers from the outside, ethnic cleansing, and other processes that have been really horrific. So just to put a little bit of meat on the bones, I could start by talking about Poland. And as you might know, the distinctive thing about Poland is that for much of modern history, Poland didn't exist. It was wiped off the map, partitioned by neighboring powers in the 18th century. Until World War I, there was no Poland. From between the two world wars in the 20th century, Poland came back to life for a time in a fairly troubled state, but then underwent an absolutely horrific experience in World War II. Poland was invaded both by Germany and the Soviet Union, and underwent the imposition of a kind of Nazi racial empire. Of course, as we know, this is Poland was the main site of the Holocaust. You could think of as the killing fields where Jews from around Europe were brought to be killed en masse. But also the Slavic population underwent a horrific treatment during World War II, kind of a treatment you could compare to European imperialism at its worst. Perhaps 3 million Christian Poles died during World War II. Hungary has a different history, but also a very troubled one. So one sees, even in the national anthem of Hungary, talk of periods of subjugation from the outside. So Hungary was traditionally dominated by, or for a long period of time, was dominated by the Ottoman Empire, then the Habsburg Empire, the Austrian Empire, and the really crucial event is that was the Treaty of Trianon in 1920. Prior to this, Hungary had established itself as kind of half of Austria-Hungary, of this big empire. In 1920, though, at the negotiating table, Hungary was carved up into multiple parts. And that was part of the process by which empires were giving way to new nation states at the negotiating table, the diplomatic process. So under the Treaty of Trianon, Hungary lost 2/3 of its territory, 60% of its peoples to Romania, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, other new states. 3 million ethnic Hungarians would live abroad after this, or live under foreign rule, one should say, after this period. And Hungary was a member of the Axis during World War II, but then underwent its own occupation by Germans, by the Nazi Germans late in the war. After World War II, things might have improved somewhat, but not very much. Both of these countries, Poland and Hungary, passed from German domination to domination by the Soviet Union. They became communist satellite states in the Eastern Bloc during the Cold War. Both Poland and Hungary rebelled against communist power in the 1950s. In Hungary, there was a very bloody revolution. So what's the upshot of all of this? Both of these countries carry a sense of national victimhood and loss. They're taught by history to see danger to their national culture, the idea that their national culture might be extinguished. Talking to Hungarians, you often hear about, from all walks of life, you hear about the tragedy of the Treaty of Trianon. Right? If you ever go to Warsaw or have been there, the capital of Poland, you see monuments everywhere attesting to the troubled history of the city and of the country. I think of Warsaw as kind of a cityscape of national mourning. So this is the kind of context in which we're talking about these countries. So I want to then fast forward, though, to 1989. So 1989, as we know, is the end of the Cold War. The Berlin Wall falls. In this part of the world in Eastern Europe, it's a period of incredible optimism, a period of great mass mobilization of the people against these communist regimes. The communist states are eventually toppled, kind of like dominoes, all across Eastern Europe. And Eastern Europeans see this moment as a moment of homecoming, coming back to Europe, back to their European roots, so to speak, right? And they very quickly set out to join NATO and the European Union to reintegrate with Western Europe. On the surface, this transition was very successful. In the 1990s, both states became members of NATO. They created Western-style liberal democracies, and then they joined the European Union in 2004 in the first wave of admission of these post-communist states. However, the transition from communism to democracy was more troubled than it would look like at first glance. And if I want to just briefly mention a few factors. First is the economic transition. And I think this story might not be known very well in the United States. The transition from communism to capitalism was very painful everywhere in the European communist states. The new capitalism made much of the socialist economy obsolete. It created a giant rust belt overnight. It created new winners and losers, a sense of instability for people who had relied on the state for their entire lives, all of a sudden to kind of face the sink or swim kind of conditions of capitalism. And so you see a degree of really nostalgia for the communist era. In 2009, 72% of Hungarians said they had lived better under communism than after communism. And that's true of much of Eastern Europe. So that's one factor, the economic transition. Another one is this kind of more kind of geographical fact of a continuing sense of seeing themselves on the periphery of Europe. Economic growth did happen in this part of the world, in large part because funds shot into this part of the world from Western Europe, particularly once these countries joined the European Union. Nevertheless, these countries were less developed than Western Europe. And in part because of that, they were marked by extreme levels of out-migration. So since 1989, Poland has seen something like maybe 2 million people immigrate to the West, taking advantage of open borders in the European Union. You see the UK, Germany, other places. I remember visiting Ireland and seeing entire suburbs of Dublin where all the signs were in Polish. And the stereotype was the Polish plumber who would come and take the jobs of West Europeans, or that was the kind of urban myth, but in fact, these were often young and very highly educated people who sought a better life abroad. And then another factor to just in the kind of big sweeping developments kind of department to think about is the political system, which these countries did become integrated democracies, and that was a real accomplishment. But you still saw and see a lot of mistrust of elites, a sense that elites in these societies were corrupt, that they often owed their wealth to backgrounds in the communist system, and had managed to then become capitalists. This has been a problem. And in the 2008 global financial crisis kind of deepened, I think, that sense of malaise in this part of the world as well. So the key point here is that the populists I'm talking about really exploited this situation quite intelligently. And what's interesting is that both of these movements I want to talk about are started during the communist era as democratic movements, anti-communist democratic movements. So Fidesz is an acronym for Alliance of Young Democrats. It was a youth organization that essentially supported freedom. Viktor Orban made a famous speech asking Russian soldiers to leave. And here you see him in this younger incarnation of Viktor Orban. The Polish situation is somewhat comparable. A fun fact about the Polish situation is that it was led by two identical twins who were teen actors in the 1960s and very, very cute. But then they went on and in the 1980s, when this massive movement developed in Poland against communist rule, here we see one of the Kaczynski brothers in the front. This regime that we see in Poland really emerged from this democratic opposition. So here is, of course, Wałęsa, who's the leader of Solidarity. And both of these movements, Law and Justice in Poland and Fidesz in Poland in Hungary, started as relatively centrist political parties. Only with time did they move to the far right. And both parties actually came into power once and then left again before returning. And what I want to argue is that their success in coming to power, subverting democracy to an extent, is their use of nationalism and national history. So I want to talk about three areas in which these regimes have really mobilized, harnessed history. The first is, I guess you could say, historical memory, talking about the past. The second is this issue of multiculturalism. And the third is a matter of social conservatism, one could call it. So I want to start by talking about history and how these regimes talk incessantly about history and try to control the ways in which history is discussed and debated. And in particular, both of these regimes, I think the key to their success is that they exploit the kind of national trauma about which I spoke a minute ago. And built a kind of narrative of the virtuous kind of victimhood of their peoples, which has allowed them, has given them great political benefit. So in the case of Hungary, Viktor Orban very quickly after coming to power made the anniversary of the Treaty of Trianon, which I had mentioned, a day of national solidarity, so made it a holiday. And more controversially, I think he granted citizenship to Hungarians living abroad. So he cultivates Hungarians beyond the Hungarian borders in a way that I think is quite unique in Europe, to play this kind of, I wouldn't call it irredentism, because he's not actually trying to invade Romania, but he goes to Transylvania, a historical place, and gives speeches to the Hungarian minority in Ukraine, Romania, other places. The Orban regime has also really kind of frenetically been engaged in the creation, the change of museums and monuments. So here is a monument that was just erected a few years ago on the 100th anniversary of the Treaty of Trianon, and it's a national tomb, kind of symbolic tomb before the Parliament building. And on the sides of this structure are named all the towns and villages of historical Hungary. So Hungarian cities that in many cases aren't within the country, in the borders of contemporary Hungary. The Hungarians have also been very engaged in trying to police historical discourse. So giving some discourses and then trying to close off others and control other discourses. So in this regard, I think the most important thing to mention is the Central European University. And this was it was and is a very interesting institution, a joint US-Hungarian university, research university. It was founded by George Soros, the financier of Hungarian origins, who really spent billions of dollars in Eastern Europe on civil society projects, fostering democracy. And an interesting aspect of this is that Viktor Orban himself was a protege of, in his liberal phase, as a liberal youth, you could say, was a protege of Soros. So Central European University was and is a very vibrant, interesting place where, you know, kind of cutting edge history, sociology, these kinds of disciplines are developed. And kind of under a legal pretext, Viktor Orban eventually forced this university out of the country. It's now moved to Austria recently. And along with this attack on Central European University was accompanied by a very nasty kind of attack on Soros himself, who was depicted as a kind of enemy of the nation, and in a very, really evoking very anti-Semitic terms. So one blog by a Hungarian oppositionist portrayed this vision, which compares on the left a propaganda poster, an anti-Soros poster showing Soros, you know, controlling socialist politicians, you know, as puppets, and compared that to the image on the right, which is a Nazi image of world Jewry controlling Churchill and Roosevelt. So this kind of echoing these kinds of anti-Semitic tropes that have been so destructive in this part of the world. So to turn to Poland a little bit, one can see, I think, a similar process of creating certain kinds of historical discourses while suppressing other discourses. So here one has to talk about the so-called Smolensk tragedy. So one of the great, really horrific chapters in Polish history of the 20th century was that during World War II, the Soviet Union murdered thousands and thousands of officers, prisoners of war officers of the Polish army in 1940. This was in the Katyn Forest episode, essentially. Through a kind of horrible irony, in 2010, then President Lech Kaczynski and about 100 politicians, senior military people, and others traveled to Russia to commemorate the Katyn massacres. And on the way, their plane fell and all of them died. And the Law and Justice Party created this kind of conspiracy theory that this was a mass murder. They blamed the Russians, kind of in cahoots with Polish liberals, for killing for taking down the plane. None of this is true. They were trying to land a plane in a storm, but that's the kind of narrative that developed. And so, in essence, kind of utilizing that theme of utilizing past national victimhood, right, for present political purposes. Poland has also engaged in kind of trying to, or I should say the Polish government has tried to engage in controlling historical discourses. And here one should mention a 2018 law, which sought to criminalize discourse blaming Poles or the Polish government for the Holocaust. And this was part of the buildup to this proposed law was the fact that people were using the term Polish death camps to refer to the Holocaust. And in fact, Barack Obama made a reference to Polish death camps. And this is, of course, an incorrect term. These were Nazi death camps on Polish territory. And you can understand why Poles would be upset by the use of this terminology. At the same time, though, what was really going on was an attempt to kind of control historical discourse. So one of the causes of this was the fact that you had critical historical scholarship uncovering evidence that there were scattered, or more or less scattered, I guess one could say, evidence of that ethnic Poles had taken part in the Holocaust in various ways during World War II. So due to the anger of the US and Israeli governments, this law was eventually kind of weakened. It hasn't, they're not putting people in jail for speaking incorrectly about the Holocaust. But nevertheless, the damage was done, I think, and one saw an increase of anti-Semitic kind of talk in Polish discourse. So why do these regimes talk so incessantly about history? Why are they so obsessed with history? And I think there's a few things that have to be mentioned in that connection. First of all, is that populist movements, by their very nature, or at least right-wing populist movements, claim a monopoly on national expression, representing the nation. They say our followers are the true nation, right? So this is very clearly an attempt to stigmatize, demonize the opposition, domestic opposition, as insufficiently nationalistic. And one sees that very clearly in Hungary, for instance. NGOs dealing with civil liberty issues have to register as foreign agents if they take funds from abroad, right? So that kind of drives that home. The fact that they're really playing this is part of a domestic political calculus on their part. But there's also an international aspect, right? Trying to mobilize the population against the European Union. So while carrying out something akin to a soft constitutional coup, or attempting to, this is a way of keeping external scrutiny from the European Union at a distance by stressing this national discourse. So that brings me into the second theme I want to talk about, which is this kind of broader issue of multiculturalism, of national identity in a broad sense. And here I want to start by talking about the last time Hungary has been very much in the news, I guess you could say. 2015, there was this massive refugee crisis. Thousands of asylum seekers from Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan as well, were stranded in Hungary. They had come up through the Balkans, through Serbia, and into Hungary, which is the European Union. Most of them were trying to pass to Germany. And during this, and as we know, eventually Germany let in roughly 1 million refugees in 2015. But during this whole episode, this was highly politicized by the Orban government. So the Hungarian government adopted very hostile language to refer to these migrants. Talked about a migrant invasion. Eventually, they caused problems for the movement of the migrants, but eventually let them through to Germany. But then closed the border between Hungary and Serbia, built a fence. So before the wall in Trump's America, one had a border fence on the European Union. And in particular, they rejected also a German initiative to resettle refugees across the European Union through a kind of quota system. So both regimes, I think, used this migration crisis as a way of creating a kind of fear in the local population. They warned of the Islamicization of their societies, the end to a European way of life. And this, of course, is also very, I think, very cynical on their part. And people noticed that, for instance, in Hungary, when these migrants were passing through, posters were put up for them, telling them, where to go or what to do. And they were in the Hungarian language, which, of course, none of these migrants would have possibly been able to speak. So clearly, they were directed towards a domestic political kind of audience. So there's a political element here as well, right? But what else is going on? Part of it is, of course, racism and Islamophobia. It's, in both countries, there was talk of these migrants as kind of carriers of parasites and kind of a threat to biological threat almost in the way that we, so very clearly a racist discourse. On another level, this whole issue of migration and migration from outside Europe gets at really core questions about national identity in this part of the world. And what's important here is that Western Europe, ever since World War II, essentially, has been shifting towards multicultural societies, I could say. They're increasingly diverse in terms of faith, in terms of race, and this did not happen in Eastern Europe. Right? Eastern Europe remains overwhelmingly monochrome in terms of its ethnic makeup. So in Hungary, I think a little over 1% of the population was born outside Hungary, very similar to in Poland as well. And that's also a legacy of communism. Communism had closed borders. So after World War II, this migration didn't happen into Eastern Europe. And as a result of that, or connected to that, I guess we could say, in Eastern Europe, there's overwhelmingly a kind of ethnic understanding of the nation. So in other words, Hungarians, it's not a civic designation. It means people who are Hungarians are of Hungarian descent, presumably, in an ethnic sense, right? And therefore, there's skepticism about whether people from the Middle East could ever belong to the nation. In this kind of sense, right? And I want to emphasize that this is very much a product of the history of this region, as I mentioned. And by the same token, if in Germany and other countries, nationalism or ethnic nationalism is taboo to a large extent, that's not the case in Eastern Europe in the same way, right? Where the Poles and Hungarians celebrate the nationalism being used to liberate their lands against external powers, and as I mentioned, they faced great external threats in their throughout their history. So this is really a crucial kind of dividing line in Europe, and a real challenge to these countries, and it's clearly provided a useful rhetorical tool for these regimes. I should also mention that it also gets at this relationship between the European Union and Hungary and Poland. That both of the leaders of these countries, Kaczynski and others in Poland, Orban in Hungary, it's striking how they talk about the European Union almost as a kind of imperial power, as if they had partitioned Poland, like in the 18th century. Of course, this is nonsense because these countries had willingly joined the European Union, and actually it was a painful process to get in. But there's something going on there that I think is an important issue. In order to get into the European Union, these countries had to jump through a lot of hoops. They had to prove that they had Western-style institutions. And I think that created bitterness, a sense that that Eastern Europeans weren't viewed as being fully European by the West, right? And so, interestingly enough, this migration problem gives a chance for East Europeans, or at least in these two countries, these two states, to kind of turn the tables. Right, so you hear the talk of a kind of conspiracy theories that bureaucrats in Brussels or the European Union headquarters are in cahoots with Hungarian liberals to deliberately bring in illegal immigrants to destroy the Christian identity of the country. And this is kind of a way of turning the tables on Western Europe and saying, we're the real Europeans, with this kind of more ethnic idea of nationalism rather than the Western Europeans. So that's what I wanted to say about the whole issue of migration. And I wanted to turn then to my third kind of area where I think these states have really used the past and the national past in a way to solidify their political control. And that has to do with values or social conservatism. So this, again, is part of this, it's part of populism as a whole. All populists depict themselves as champions of the simple people, of the virtuous simple people. The other simple people maybe are not of their concern. And so both of these parties in Poland and Hungary, once in power, they have actually, I think, delivered to some extent to their constituents in various ways. They've tried to provide material benefits to their supporters. And that's one way that they've managed to stay in power for as long as they have. But they've done so in a very traditional way. And one sees this in a traditional kind of national way. And one sees this particularly in the Polish case, where law and justice has an extremely strong connection to the Catholic Church. Catholicism is very important, especially these days, to Polish national identity. So, for instance, these kinds of initiatives to help families in Poland, right? So, providing cash benefits for the number of children Poles have, for instance. These kinds of programs have been quite popular. In part, I think, there's been a kind of a genuine effort to support the nation in this sense. But there's also the flip side of that, right? So if promoting on one hand what is national, you're always kind of demeaning what's non-national or other. And in this case, one sees an extreme kind of homophobia in the Polish case, for instance. So several cities, or really many cities and towns in Poland, have declared themselves to be LGBT-free zones, which essentially means that they claim they reject LGBT ideology. Right? So they're not going to allow pride marches, for instance, right? Of course, one could imagine that a statement like that, we are an LGBT-free zone, would lead to much more than just, banning pride marches, but other kinds of infringements of civil liberties. So what's going on here in this kind of extreme social conservatism in this part of the world? Again, I think part of it is kind of getting back at Western Europe and the kind of different traditions across the European continent. Part of it, I think, interestingly enough, is although these regimes are very anti-communist, I think part of this is that they understand that there's a strong nostalgia for among some sectors of the population, for the communist system, for a state that takes care of the people. Right? That there was a kind of stability under the communist order that was attractive to many people, and so I think that's interesting. That's a specifically East European angle in all of this. But I think there's also a real anxiety in these states about demography, and as I mentioned, there's huge outmigration, young people leaving to the West. The population generally is shrinking in this part of the world. And so you see, for instance, this is part of a speech from Viktor Orban, who's basically imploring young people, stay, the homeland needs you, and if you leave, you might realize the homeland's gone. So again, this kind of fear of national extinction that's so central, I think, to the understanding of nationalism in this part of the world. So I'd like to conclude now. I think I'm well in my time limits, but just to conclude, what I've tried to argue is that to understand the success of populism in this part of the world, at least one important part of the puzzle is to think about the use and misuse of history, right? And that these regimes have been successful precisely by harnessing national narratives and national history. However, I don't want to leave you with pessimism. I don't want to leave on a pessimistic note, I guess one would say. These political systems, as all political systems, are a work in progress, and history is being made as it's being talked about in Eastern Europe. So I want to talk about a few things that I think are providing pressures against these regimes that are quite important. And the first is the challenge of Europe. What I mean by that is that there's a backlash in Europe against these states that have taken huge amounts of money from the European Union. Part of the European Union is to distribute wealth from richer to poorer members. Some estimates are that Poland has received, 30 or 40 billion euros in the sense, these figures are hard to pin down, but huge amounts of money have entered into this part of the world from the European Union. And yet this money has been used to build regimes that really flaunt the principles of the European Union in terms of rule of law, in terms of corruption, in terms of democratic checks and balances. Viktor Orban, it's true, has shown great skill in dealing with the European Union. Often he kind of pretends to make concessions, drags his heels. It's very complicated political dance, one could say. But I think there's evidence that things are coming to a head in this regard. So, for instance, some procedures are underway that would remove the voting rights from these two countries within the European Union. That might not happen because Poland and Hungary might defend each other if this should come to the fore. Just recently in the news, though, there was a discussion of the EU budget, which is, we're talking, over €1 trillion being held up precisely because Poland and Hungary didn't want funding to be connected to rule of law conditions, right? So this is an interesting struggle to watch moving forward, is the challenge between Europe and these populist regimes in Eastern Europe. But I think even more important, and sorry, I realize I have one more image or a few more images to project, I'll bring this back up, is the kind of domestic challenges that these regimes are facing. And again, this is exactly in the news. So in Hungary, there has been some mass protest, particularly against the final closure of the Central European campus in Budapest. But even more so in Poland, one has seen very large protest movements just recently. This is a far-right protest, but there's also, more importantly, in the last really 3 weeks or so, been a massive protest wave against restrictions on abortion laws in Poland, which basically almost made all abortion illegal in Poland. And one saw, the biggest street demonstration since 1989 in this part of the world. So very interesting kind of developments here. One saw, vigilantes from supporting the regime, protecting churches, protesters trying to interrupt church services. Very interesting mass conflict, right? Extreme division. And it's important to point out that both Fidesz and Law and Justice in Poland have only ever maybe had a little more than a third of the electorate in terms of their votes. So their power and their pretensions to control the state have never quite been matched by their public support. And I think that's a really important note to finish my comments with, right? That one can draw a hopeful conclusion that national identity is always manipulated, harnessed. National history is additionally used for political ends, and I think we can think about this country as well to a great extent. But of course, history is always being written and rewritten. And national identity itself is always contested. People will always have different ideas about what it means to be an American, what it means to be a Pole, and that to me is a hopeful way to think about the topic I've spoken to you about today. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Tromley. And your conclusion sort of anticipates questions that have been coming in on the chat almost since you started talking. Early in your presentation, you showed a monument commemorating the many thousands of dead. One of our participants this evening noticed lots of Christian crosses, no stars of David, and was wondering why there was no recognition of all the Jewish lives lost at the same time.
Yes, I think that specific monument has crosses and stars of David in it. I believe, if I'm recalling that, that was a monument to the invasion by the Soviets. And of course, the Soviets didn't carry out the Holocaust, right? So that might be part of that specific part of the story. But the question is a very important one, which is balancing these victim narratives, right? Poles have been very reluctant. Well, I have to phrase this carefully. Obviously the main victims of the Nazis were the Jews in Poland, right? And if you look at the number of Jews killed in Poland versus the number of Christians killed in Poland, of course the percentage is off the charts, even though it's about 3 million of each, right? And that does remind us that the Poles were really victims in World War II, very much so, ethnic Poles. Of course, part of the complicating narrative on that is that, as I mentioned, in East European history of the 20th century, sometimes victims victimize other people, right? So you have ethnic Poles who were involved in also carrying out atrocities against Jews. But yes, it's very hard to balance or to assert Polish victimhood while acknowledging the supreme suffering of the Jews during World War II. So that's absolutely, there's been controversies about people putting up crosses at Auschwitz. This has been an off and on thing. A religious congregation tried to put up crosses there and said, well, we were killed too. And of course there were ethnic Poles who were killed in Auschwitz, right? But of course, so that creates it's a very sensitive and difficult topic, I guess what I would say. And one that is painful for really all sides in the debate.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. So Professor Tromley, another question that came in from Tom Rainey is, to what extent is Vladimir Putin encouraging and supporting these two dictators from the sidelines? Their regimes increasingly resemble Putin's regime in Russia.
That's a terrific question. And here the story is a very divided one, right? Because clearly the Polish leaders have modeled their rule on Hungary, but Poland has a very, very anti-Russian stance, whereas Hungary is very friendly with Orban, and Putin are very friendly. Since several years, there's been heavy Russian investment into nuclear energy, for instance, in Hungary within the EU, which has caused a lot of heads to turn in the EU that Russian nuclear assets would be in, nuclear energy investment would be in Europe. But for the Poles, that option isn't really there because the Russians are so much a part of there's so much hostility historically. So that's a question that really divides the two regimes. One could say. So thank you, great question.
And then somebody else is asking, what parallels do you see within the United States and Eastern Europe and Turkey in light of how President Trump is denying the results of losing the election and refusing a civil and historic transfer of power?
Yes, I mean, I should qualify this by saying that I'm not a specialist in American politics, although I certainly am living in the country and witnessing everything that everyone else is seeing and thinking about. Um, I mean, I think there are similarities. You know, that I mentioned, these are movements that started, they in fact started very liberal, but then they were centrist, and then they moved to the right when they realized that that's where political power was. And I think you could see a certain degree of, you could see comparison, I think, with the way that the direction of the Republican Party in recent years under the Trump administration, a kind of surge to the right. For all sorts of reasons that might be strategic, opportunistic, ideological, you know, all of the above. So I think that's an important point to make. I mean, I think it's also interesting that you know, if you compare as leaders, someone like Viktor Orban and Donald Trump. I mean, Viktor Orban twice was voted out, or he was voted out of office once. His party has lost over and over again in elections. He's incredibly persistent, a very, very smart politician. And of course, that's very different than Donald Trump, who just kind of came in from in politics from outside the political system. So I think there's important differences in the ways these regimes have kind of worked, right? In terms of their dynamics, but I think the parallels are of course there. And I would mention also, just to say that it's the second time when these populists came in that they knew how to subvert the system particularly well. So Orban came into power in 2010, immediately changes the constitution, and to try to protect his own power. So I think that's another sign that these kinds of populist movements learn over time and learn how to control the instruments of power. So I don't know, those are some of the many thoughts that I have when thinking about the comparisons in this context. So.
Great, thank you. Another question that came in is, how important are the EU and NATO in moderating any of the Polish Hungarian nationalism?
Yeah, I mean, as I tried to talk about a little bit at the end, there's an attempt at that, right? So this Article 7 mechanism, which would remove voting rights, but it's very hard because the EU has so many members, and it works, many things have to be kind of unanimously decided, which is in some ways the beauty of the European Union, right? In that it's very stable in that sense. It represents all the interests of the constituent countries. But on the other hand, it's very slow. And it works under often very kind of arcane, legalistic kind of mechanisms. So it has been very frustrating to many observers to watch the reactions to Orban over the last 10 years. But as I kind of suggested, my sense is that could be coming to a head. Right, in particular, I mean, because there is just a huge amount of wealth flowing into these countries, and they really have, the European Union really has underwritten these states and these political changes that I've tried to describe to you today. And I think that one would think would eventually come to a head, and maybe there would be a crisis. Who knows where it's going? Of course, the irony is that Britain is leaving the European Union. The Poles and the Hungarians don't want to leave the European Union, even though they hate it, right? Because they realize that they realize they benefit from a deal. So it's this very complicated kind of relationship of taking money from the EU but not doing what you know, but pursuing their own nationalistic interests.
And another questioner says that Russia and Ukraine have made overtures to nationalist churches, and have either of the regimes in Poland or Hungary tried to use organized religion to help promote their nationalist populism?
Yes, I mean, particularly in Poland, it's very clear that the abortion laws that, you know, that have caused such protests in recent weeks. I mean, I think it was carried out by the Constitutional Court, which is of course controlled by Fidesz. But clearly the Catholic Church wields a great deal of authority. In Hungary, Hungary is a much less religious country. It has to do with Hungarian history. This was a country where you had the kind of Reformation and then Counter-Reformation. You don't have the kind of degree of strong Catholic practice that you do in Poland. But there too, you see definitely a hearkening to Christian principles, right? And this kind of idea of almost, you know, we're the Christian civilization defending ourselves against Islam, right? That's the kind of narrative that you kind of got during the migration crisis and onward. So yeah, I think religion is very important in this context.
And do you see these nationalist and populist movements growing into other parts of Europe, such as the Baltic nations?
I think that's a great question. I think that generally speaking, there aren't any regimes like the two I've talked about in Eastern Europe. There are, however, various kinds of inflections. There are similarities, right? So one could point to Czechoslovakia, where you don't have the same kind of rightist populist ideology, discussion of history in the same way that you do in Poland or Hungary, but you do have a rejection of the refugee quotas, for instance, and this defense of a more ethnically defined nation. The Balkans are very interesting because there, of course, you have potential EU expansion, you have Russian influence, and I think the story of I think the really amazing thing about the EU is how popular, how much other countries outside the EU in Europe want to get in, right? And one saw that in Ukraine, where there was a national revolution. And they called it the European Square, where they were protesting this regime. So I think that the idea of Europe, of the EU, is still very powerful in the Balkans, and will have lots of influence in places. Croatia is already a member, but I think it's safe to say that. That the European idea is still very strong in these areas. It becomes weaker, ironically, for these countries who have been in since 2004, and came in, I think it's safe to say, with maybe inflated expectations that they would come into the EU and a few years later they'd be living like Germans and have lots of wealth, right? And of course that isn't what's happened. One sees countries like Bulgaria, which are very poor, very corrupt, but has entered the European Union. So it's kind of that problem of what you do once you're in, whereas in fact towards other powers, I think the European Union is still a very attractive option.
And another participant wants to know, why is George Soros so demonized both in Hungary and by the right in our country?
I'm not an expert on his biography, but I think one has to see the multiple layers here, right? This revolt kind of against post-national liberalism, I guess you could say, multicultural post-national kind of liberalism. This idea of surpassing national interests, right? That idea, which is in a sense really the European Union's core idea, is transcending national divisions. That's why it was born, to undo the logjam between France and Germany after World War II, which it succeeded in doing to a great deal. That idea is, let me see if I can phrase this correctly, is easily, one could say, distorted and taken into a kind of criticism of cosmopolitanism, of liberal elites, right? That's really what populism is about, is distrust of liberal elites. That's a big part of it, right? And in that sense, you have Soros as kind of a symbol of that, as a financier, right? And then, of course, you have in this part of the world the anti-Semitic element on top of it, as I mentioned, right? Which, even though Jews make up 0.1% of the Hungarian population, anti-Semitism is still very powerful, not just in Hungary. I don't want to single out only the Hungarians, but Ukraine and other parts of this of Eastern Europe. So I think Soros is kind of almost a symbol, just by the nature of his activities, his democracy promotion, finance, and his own Jewish origins. That all the populist pieces kind of fit together with him in a sense, if that makes sense.
Great, thank you. And I think we have our final question. Do these nationalist demagogues try to demonize or control the news media, like here, to stop critical examination, reporting, and control the narrative?
Absolutely, absolutely, very much so. And you know, I didn't really talk about this, but it's worth mentioning that Orban and Trump got along very well together in the past years, and I believe, I don't quote me on this, this might have been true a few days ago at least, that Orban has not congratulated Biden on the victory in the, so China has, right? Many countries have, but Orban is holding out. So there's that relationship I just wanted to mention in passing because it might be interesting to the listeners. But yes, in terms of the news media, it's safe to say that the media is controlled there much more than in the United States, right? In many cases, public media was taken over by the ruling party. Private media was taken over by cronies, friends of Orban, businessmen. So you have this kind of crony capitalism where people in these political parties control all the different kinds of media. So you have some free media, but very little. You have, the internet and some small publications. Whereas in the U.S., I think it's safe to say we have a free press, but then we have, we also have, how should one put this? A very divided information space in which you have certain kinds of news feeding into certain narratives, and one sees that, of course, as the listener asked about our elections and reporting on the elections. That's exactly so I think there is a difference here, and in that regard, I think that's a hopeful message for us that we still have a free press, and that's one place where I think at least Hungary has surpassed us. Poland is more of, I think, an open book. I think it's not clear which way Poland will go. I think it's the regime hasn't established itself with the same success that the Hungarians have. So that's also potentially something to look to be hopeful about, is the state of Polish democracy. You have the embrace of freedom. I don't want to suggest that these histories are purely negative. You have Polish movements for freedom. That's also part of their national identity, right? So that's kind of where I wanted to end with, is a more slightly optimistic note. Thank you.
And to just quickly follow up on that, Professor Tromley, is there no, let's see, is there a standard in the European Union about a free press? Do you understand what I'm saying? I mean, we have a principle in this country of a free press. Is there such a principle in the European Union?
Oh, yes, and there's been pushback through the courts against the restrictions on the media, but also the restrictions on the rule of law. So this is another area where these states that I've talked about today are much more, I think it's safe to say, have moved more in the authoritarian direction than the United States, where judges, well, maybe you could say that that's happening here too, to an extent, but there, especially say in Hungary, you really have control over the judicial profession, and judges who who are kind of illegally appointed to the constitutional court, these kinds of things. So very strong control over the legal system in Eastern Europe, or at least in Hungary and Poland. And so yes, there definitely have been voices of opposition throughout Europe. But as I mentioned, Europe is a vast and bureaucratic entity. And so far, all of the people who have tried to challenge these two states haven't had much luck. But that could change.
Thank you. Thank you. This proved to be extremely timely given the transition our own country is going through right now. So we appreciate your presentation. It's thought-provoking. And that is the last of our questions that came through the chat room to us. So I think your job now may be done, Professor Tromley. Thank you very much. And once more, thank you to everybody who joined us this evening. You can see from the list of participants, we had close to 60 people in our audience tonight, so that's nice. And please don't forget that next month is not the third Thursday, but instead the second Thursday of the month for our presentation. That would be December 10th, and you'll receive an announcement about that program before it happens. So thank you all very much for joining us. We appreciate our members very much, and we very much appreciate our presenters. So Professor Tromley, consider this a virtual applause for your presentation this evening. Thank you all, and good night.